And today we're going to be talking about the notion of appropriation art, its origins, but more importantly, kind of how it evolved and how it's really informed the way artists make work today. So, appropriation art has resulted in a kind of contentious copyright issue. And copyright law exists because of it. The United States has been fairly litigious in this respect, and there's been a number of laws that have emerged that really do look at the division between transformative artworks and derivative artworks. Okay, so there is a difference. And if you don't know, appropriation art is just simply the use of, pre-existing or pre-consumed objects or images with little or no transformation applied to them. So whenever you're asking me, how much do I need to change it? Well, if it's changed significantly and apparently, it stands up as your own, typically. So strict appropriation, hopefully, will be a little bit more clear to you after this lecture. So Marcel Duchamp, of course, in 1915, he introduced the concept of the ready-made, which, in his words, industrially produced utilitarian objects. They achieve the status of art merely through the process of selection and presentation. So Duchamp explored this idea in 1913, when, of course, he mounted the bicycle wheel on the stool. In 1917, he organized the submission of this piece, which of course is known as the fountain. And it's just, a urinal, right? Signed R. Mutt, and it's signed R. Mutt to be nonsensical. And of course it's signed with the date. So the work, what it did is it posed a very clear and direct challenge to these traditional perceptions of what fine art is. It dealt with ownership, originality, it dealt with plagiarism. It was rejected by the exhibition committee. Not a lot of people know that. So in New York, there was a Dada magazine, and Dada, as you know, hopefully means it's a nonsense word. The magazine was called The Blind Man, and The Blind Man defended the fountain. It claimed, quote, "Whether Mr. Mutt with his own hands made the fountain or not is of no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, and created a new thought for that object." So in the 20th century, Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, together, simultaneously, worked together and created Cubism. They appropriated objects from non-art contexts in their work, and you see here newspapers. In 1912, Picasso pasted a piece of oilcloth to the canvas. So his subsequent compositions, guitar, newspaper, glass of bottle, around, 1913 or so, he used newspaper clippings in order to create forms. And essentially, he has been credited as the inventor of collage. So the two artists incorporated aspects of the real world into both of their canvases. They opened up a whole slew of discussions, but most importantly, the significance of artistic representation. So, inherent in our understanding of appropriation, it's the concept that the new work, what it does, recontextualizes whatever it borrows to create the new work. So in most cases, the original thing remains accessible and as accessible as the original without change. So what you're actually looking at is the work of Richard Prince. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, he was sued over and over again. And this is the piece that he was most famously sued over. And so it was a series of photographs of Rastafari in Jamaica done by a professional photographer. And what Richard Prince did, although he had 20 years of appropriation art under his belt already, This is one of the first times that he was really, gone after in such a sort of aggressive way. So the court made a decision. They ruled against him initially and said that every single book that Richard Prince had published with any of these guys' images, and I don't even remember the original guy's name, had to be destroyed. And that he was going to forfeit, I don't know, some kind of millions of dollars. Well, he appealed, and he took it back to court, and a new judge oversaw the case and chose differently. So this is a quote from the judge for the second case. This decision absolutely clarifies that the law does not require that a new work of art comment on any of its source material to qualify as fair use. This is written by, the attorney. So what does that mean? That means the use of an image does not actually warrant having to change it. It's the appropriation, the act of appropriating that actually changes it because you've changed its context, which is a complicated idea, and many of you might not sit well with that at all. And he did physically actually transform the images. He didn't directly appropriate, not changing them at all. He would paint on them, silkscreen, collage onto them. He actually transformed the images. So that statement is a very odd statement to make when it concerns Richard Prince. In 2009, a business called Cariou brought a copyright infringement lawsuit against Prince and Gagosian Gallery. Gagosian is run by a guy named Lawrence Gagosian, and the catalog publisher Rizzoli. A lot of the art books in the library are published by Rizzoli. They're a big art publishing house. So in March 2011, a United States District Court judge, Deborah Batts, she ruled against Prince. So it goes back and forth, right? And that was one of the very early cases against him. And he's always been an appropriation artist. And you see here some paintings that he made on top of already established book designs. And these are blown up, printed, and then painted on top of. So these are actually painted by an illustrator for a book and then readapted into something else. So during the 1970s and 80s, he would re-photograph advertisements. He's known for appropriating the Marlboro Man, from the Marlboro cigarettes, and photojournalism. And, he would reprint them and he would sort of work on them, but he's also worked in collage as well. So his works take a kind of anonymous and ubiquitous, advertising campaign that might seem really banal to you. And what he does is he elevates the status and focuses our gaze on the images. He asks us to reconsider them. How can you talk about advertising in the art world without using advertising? Right? So he's been stirring up more feelings of agitation. His most recent show confused a lot of people. And what he did was he blew up photos taken from his Instagram feed. The photos were generally of young women in seductive or very vulnerable poses. And they come from several accounts. The Suicide Girls, if you're familiar with them, they're sort of a queer collective of a lot of strippers who are very tattooed and very sort of, my sexual agency. A sex writer named Carly Fiorentino and the musician Sky Fiera. So the installation called New Portraits was up in New York at Gagosian in 2014. It resurfaced in the public consciousness once the photos started selling for as much as $100,000. This goes back to the work of somebody like Sherry Levine. And Sherry Levine was a direct appropriation artist. She quotes entire works. And by photographing photographs, that's what you're looking at here, the works of like Walker Evans, this is a very famous, The Migrant Mother, What does it do? It challenges ideas of originality. It draws attention to the relations between power, gender, creativity, consumerism, and commodity value. And all of these, of course, are the social sources and uses of art. So she plays with the theme of almost same. So they're photographs of photographs. They're very meta, right? It's one reproduction after another. And what that actually goes back to is a seminal essay, which I'm probably going to have you read, but if I don't, you should read it, called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction by Walter Benjamin. And that is quoted in art schools everywhere. Walter Benjamin. And he wrote it towards the end of his life, and it is essentially, the idea is that an artwork has an aura. And that aura is diminished when it is reproduced. So the original has a kind of spiritual totemic power to it, and the more it's mediated, or the more it's reproduced, it loses the original intention that the artist had, therefore becoming a political device or a manipulated device, like propaganda. So the work of Jeff Koons, I couldn't possibly do this lecture without showing his work, and this is some of his most recent work where he's, and of course you all know that he doesn't actually lay paint to his paintings. He has had his studio reproduce great masterworks, and very simply he has essentially attached these kind of chrome balls to the front of them. And they act as obstructions, but they also act as another mirror, a distorting mirror. And what is that? But reflection as mediation. Is he that smart? Probably. I don't know, though. That's up for debate. And all of his images are taken from the outside world, the world of advertising, the world of popular culture. One could call him a pop artist. And here are some paintings, and I'm just showing his paintings rather than his sculpture because this is a painting class. Can I tell you a little bit about how these are made? If you haven't watched the Art 21 on these, you should. He is a really sleazy, slimy guy. He did go to art school. The myth is that he worked on Wall Street, and he did for a little bit, but not like professionally. But he's really kind of manipulative. He talks about how perfect the viewer is, how God made you perfectly. Your creator made you perfectly. There's nothing about you that needs to change, which is a wonderful idea, but I don't believe he actually believes it. So how these are actually made is they're essentially just made mock-ups on Photoshop or Illustrator, probably Illustrator because they don't lose resolution, pulled from the internet or pulled from photography, and then his artists, which are plucked right from graduate school, right from their MFA, are employed with a working wage that is very low for Brooklyn. And he has them match the colors by the Pantone system. Y'all know the Pantone system? And he has people who mix colors. He has people who apply colors. He has people who makes the mock-ups. And he has people who blends the colors, like different people for different things. So no one can say that's my image. He is the only one who can say that's my image. So the Dada movement continued to play with appropriation in everyday objects and their combination in collage. So Dada works featured deliberate irrationality and the rejection of the standards, the traditional standards of art. Kurt Schwitters, one of my favorites, was primarily a collage artist. He shows a similar sensibility in his Mertz works. He constructed parts of these from found objects. And they look the form of a kind of, painting construction. But he was one of the purveyors of installation art. And one of his most famous installations was absolutely transforming his own apartment. Have any of you ever seen this? It's all paper and cardboard and thin wood, and he completely made his interior living space a walking cubist painting or sculpture. Now, it was, I can't remember, the bombing of, I forget which city it's in a German city, but it pretty much, Allies burned it to the ground. What?
Dresden.
Yes, I think it's in Dresden. It burned, and so they recreated it down the line. So Kurt Schwitters is really interesting to me as a concept and, of course, as an artist. Salvador Dali, a surrealist, sought to unnerve. These found objects would take on a new meaning when they were combined with unlikely or unsettling objects. Another one of my favorites, Joseph Cornell, at the Art Institute of Chicago. I think he was a Chicagoan. They have a whole room devoted to his boxes. And his boxes are essentially three-dimensional collages. So if you're interested in creating a kind of, these are not vignettes, they are called, I don't know, maquettes. There's a name for it, I just can't think of it. And of course, the abstract expressionists. In the 1950s, Robert Rauschenberg used what was called combines. So literally combining ready-made objects, such as tires, beds, he used paint on them, silkscreen collage, photography. And they really do sort of affect the space around them. And of course, Jasper Johns. Jasper Johns dealing with a sort of repetition of iconic imagery that is taken from the world around him. Robert Lichtenstein is pulling from comics. And then, I'm not including Warhol here because you all know Warhol. You're very familiar with him. But most of you don't know the work of Elaine Sturdivant. And Elaine Sturdivant would literally reproduce, learning the techniques and approaches each of these artists used in their work, and just created facsimiles. And she would display them as an appropriation artist around the same time that they were actually making them. So these replicated works of art, they didn't, they got a lot of attention, but she's not terribly well known in the scheme of art history. So Warhol was actually questioned about his technique around one of these shows and around Elaine Sturdivant, and he answered, I don't know, ask Elaine. Sigmar Polke, these images do look kind of timeless, especially now. He is very influential to me. He's a German artist. He was friends with Gerhard Richter, and they defined what's known as capitalist realism. And what that did was it was sort of, an idea, not really a movement, but it offered an ironic critique of consumerism in post-war Germany. So they used pre-existing photographs, and then they transformed them, and Polka's best works were his collages, essentially, of imagery from pop culture and advertising, such as his supermarkets scene of superheroes shopping in a grocery store, which I don't have included here, and the work of Gerhard Richter. And if you know anything about Gerhard Richter did simultaneously at the same time photorealist paintings while doing these massive non-objective abstractions, which essentially he pulls wet oil paint down with a squeegee, creating these sort of messes that turn out very beautifully. The painting on the right is a painting of his daughter turning away, and that's in the St. Louis Art Museum, and it's one of the most beautiful paintings I've ever seen in my life. John Baldessari lived in California. He just recently died within the last, 2 years. He was a part of what's called the Pictures Generation. It was a group of artists, and they were influenced by conceptual art and pop art. And they used appropriation and montage to investigate, constructed nature of images. So an exhibition called the Pictures Generation that actually toured from 74 to 84 was held at the Met in 2009 and included him, Barbara Kruger, Sherry Levine, Richard Prince, David Saleh, and Cindy Sherman. So these images are David Saleh, and David Saleh really is sort of a pastiche artist, one who takes a melange of images and smashes them all together. They're painted very large, and they haven't really changed too much with the time, although he is now using Photoshop as a means to make them. One of the most interesting conceptual art pieces I have ever seen, read about, or heard of is Christian Marclay's The Clock. And it's a video that is exactly, I believe, 60 minutes long. And every single second is a new clip from a movie that he's appropriated from the zeitgeist of Hollywood movies or other movies. And so it changes with every single second. Tick, 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 tick for 60 minutes. It might be 60 seconds. I think it's 60 minutes. Anyway, I don't have the attention span for 60 minutes, but I would have gotten it after about 5 minutes. Maybe 30 seconds, let's be real. And so what does that do? Well, it is about the accumulation of all of the things that we filter in our world and the beauty when we meditate about their connectedness. Right? When we think about the connectedness of images, we begin to realize its influence on us and our decisions as we navigate through the world and our relationships with each other. It's also, most importantly, a meditation on death and time. It is a memento mori without using a skull. Zevs is like kind of, nom de plume, used by this artist here who's doing a kind of reinterpretation of logos. So the artist Zev is French and essentially takes brands, logos, and paints them in such a way that they sort of look like they're sliding off or they're wet. They're decay, right? So it's about the glitz and the glamour, but also about their sort of deconstruction. It's obviously informed by street art and by graffiti. Most of you already know Banksy. So many urban and street artists use images from pop culture. And you all know Shepard Fairey too, hopefully. He did the Hope poster, who appropriated works from people like Claude Monet or Vermeer. This is Girl with a Pierced Eardrum, and the ADT thing is the box, the security box. And if you know anything about Shepard or about Banksy, is he's from Bristol in England, and I went there 2 summers ago, and it's a super artsy place, and there's a ton of street art, a ton. It's everywhere. And how he works is in the middle of the night, he will go and make a piece under complete darkness and anonymity, and the next morning, Bristol will wake up to a new Banksy piece. And obviously, when he was early and starting to work, no one really liked that. But now, because of his work, it's become an identity of the city, right? And so we had gotten there, I was there for a choral residency. No, I do not sing. But about a month before I got there, he had done a new piece. And it was a man who was sort of hanging from a windowsill, much like the windowsill you're looking at. And so it had become a stop on the tourist market. Newer artists are a little bit more unabashed and interpret or reinterpret their appropriation simply through style. So we have Michael Jackson on the left, and then we have an image of Shelley Duvall. I don't remember her name. Shelley Long from The Shining, and this is Sam McInnes. And they're sort of wonky and awkward and clumsily painted. Alison Zuckerman actually paints directly on top of prints that she constructs in Photoshop or Illustrator. And they're all pulled from art history and cartoons. And they're huge. They can be very disappointing when you see them in person because there ain't a lot of paint on them at all. But you think they are when you see them in reproduction. Nicola Samore is an Italian artist who sort of appropriates from Baroque and Renaissance painting in a very sort of dreary, drab way, and in an archival way. So he paints layer over layer over layer over layer before they even dry, so that there's just a skin of oil paint dried on it. And then he'll go and he'll purposely destroy the surface by throwing paint thinner on it or by dragging his hands over the inch of paint that has accumulated on the surface, carving like a slice in it. Urs Fischer, he does lots and lots of work, and he does not consistently follow a style, but it is a series of paintings where he obscured celebrities with various things. Very large paintings, appropriated, obviously, from Hollywood source imagery. Robert Longo, finally, is my last artist, and he's known for this body of drawings that he's only a drawer that he did in the 1980s. And of course, the 1980s are the sort of, it's the recession. There was a recession, but there was also a huge boom on Wall Street, and it produced what we know of as yuppies, the young urban professional. And all these yuppies would go to fancy restaurants. They became foodies. They lived in the hip areas. They, transformed lofts into cool places that you wanted to be. They really define the sort of hipster movement today, except they're working for the man, working for Wall Street. And so he did this entire body of work of people who look like they're falling or dodging bullets, maybe dancing, maybe having a conniption. And he would do things like throw tennis balls at them or shoot them at them, and watch them and photograph them while they responded to these things being flung at them. And then he would draw them, very large scale. And I think that the most interesting body of work that Robert Longo has done is a direct appropriation of non-objective, abstract, expressionist paintings, done in a faithful photographic manner. So he did an entire body of work that is literally the facsimile of all the, Joan Mitchell, Jackson Pollock, Klein. And I think what that does is it strips away why we look at those images. We look at those images for color, for texture, for the paint quality. What happens when you literally take that away? It becomes a meditation on how we see images. I grew up I lived 30 miles outside of Chicago, and the first time I went to the Art Institute of Chicago, I was in high school. So most of us especially who grow up poor, do not have access to original works of art. And by saying that, I think looking at images like this becomes the way that we interpret art or see it when we don't see it in person, right? It can be diminished. It is diminished. It is certainly changed. The intention of the artist is certainly changed, but it becomes a different experience when it's mediated. So, what is fair use? Some people say that only lazy people who have nothing to say let themselves be inspired by the past. Others fear that this new trend of appropriation is caused by nothing more than the wish of embedding oneself with an attractive genealogy, right? The term appropriationism reflects the overproduction of reproductions, remakings, reenactments, recreations, reconstructions by copying or imitating, repeating, quoting, plagiarizing, simulating, and adapting to pre-existing names, concepts, and forms. Appropriation is discussed as a comparison of forms and concepts of the 20th century, which offer a new representation of established knowledge. So it's a kind of racing standstill. I think fair use is something that a lot of you wring your hands over, whereas I think that the art world is so changing, so tensile, and constantly moving forward, that is not necessarily the most important question. That is an important question when you have no resources and no way to defend yourself legally, right? Richard Prince continues to appropriate. He's done so for 30, 40 years. But he has done so from a very privileged place. He can afford a team of lawyers and win those cases because he can make a cogent argument. So the Copyright Act in 1976 basically says it's fair use if you do one of these things. The purpose and character of the use, whether it be commercial or educational, transformative or reproductive, or political. So Shepard Fairey probably should not have lost that case about the Hope poster because it was used for politics, but he was really using it for art. It's fair use if the nature of the copyrighted work is fictional or factual, and the degree of creativity. Additionally, the amount of the original work used is considered. So I say 30 to 40%. If you change it 30 to 40%, it's fair use. That's what I say. But that's an arbitrary number that I came up with years ago. Right? There's no foundational law that says percentage because that is completely subjective. And of course, the effect of the use upon the market. How influential is this artist? How influential and ubiquitous does the work become? The Shepherd Fairy Hope image was over every single Vote t-shirt you saw. So he began to get a lot of money from that use, which is what made him subject to that lawsuit. Does that make sense? So it's a fluid thing, and it's a good question to ask, and philosophically that is something that a lot of you should deal with because almost all of you in here have appropriated. In fact, all of you have appropriated.